4 men dragged the possessed man down the center aisle of a stone church in southern France. He fought them so violently they could barely hold him. Waiting inside was a friar in a simple white habit. His name was Dominic de Guzmán, Saint Dominic. But instead of reaching first for holy water, instead of opening a book of exorcism prayers, Dominic reached for a rosary. Then he looked at the man and asked the demons inside him a question. How many of you are there? According to an account written centuries later by Saint Louis de Montfort, the answer that came through the possessed man's mouth was almost impossible to believe. 15,000. 15,000 demons. But that number is not the greatest mystery in this story. The real mystery is why Saint Dominic reached for the rosary in the first place. Because years earlier, Dominic had already tried almost everything. For nearly a decade, he walked from town to town across southern France. He preached, he debated publicly, he fasted, he slept on the ground. He returned again and again to people who had already rejected him. And after years of sacrifice, almost nothing changed. Then, according to Dominican tradition, Dominic found himself alone in a chapel at Prouille, exhausted, discouraged, after years of preaching with almost no fruit. And there, the Virgin Mary appeared to him, but she did not give him a stronger argument. She did not tell him to preach louder. She placed something small enough to fit inside one hand, a string of beads, the rosary, and she told him to preach with it. From that moment on, something began to change. People who had resisted years of arguments began to listen. A prayer that looked simple became one of the most powerful weapons associated with Dominic's mission. And years later, when that possessed man was dragged into the church, Dominic already knew exactly what he would reach for, the rosary. But what happened during that encounter, and why the demons themselves were said to fear the mysteries contained in that prayer, is only one part of the story. Because before Saint Dominic became the founder of an order that would shape the Catholic Church for centuries, he was a man who spent years failing at the very mission he believed God had given him. And the turning point came through something so small, it could disappear inside a closed hand. Before we continue, write in the comments, Saint Dominic, intercede for me. And if there is someone in your heart who needs prayer today, write their name as well. Now let me take you back to the beginning, to the young man who once sold the books he loved because people around him were starving, long before anyone knew his name as Saint Dominic. Domingo was born in Caleruega, in the Old Kingdom of Castile, around the year 1170. His feast is celebrated on August 8th. His family, according to tradition, had already dreamed of him before he arrived. His mother is said to have seen, before his birth, a dog leaping from her womb, carrying a burning torch in its mouth, lighting the whole world on fire. It's a mother's dream, passed down by people who loved him, not a courtroom fact. But later generations of Dominicans took it seriously enough to put a black and white dog with a torch into the crest of the order he founded. He grew up in a noble family with deep religious roots. An uncle was an archpriest. 2 of his own brothers would go on to lives of ministry and preaching. From a young age, Domingo showed the kind of seriousness that makes adults uncomfortable around children because children aren't supposed to think that hard about God. At 14, he went to study in Palencia. He spent years there, working through the arts and then theology, and by all early accounts, he was talented enough to build a comfortable career out of it. He didn't. There was a famine in the region while he studied. People were starving in the streets around him while he sat with books he had paid good money for, so he sold them. He sold his books, his notes, even his own writing desk, and used the money to feed people who were dying of hunger in front of him. Dominican tradition remembers what he said when someone asked how he could give up the tools of his own education. He would not study on dead skins, he said, while living men were dying of hunger. The exact words may have softened or sharpened a little over 8 centuries of retelling. What hasn't softened is the choice underneath them. He didn't theorize about mercy from a comfortable distance. He sold the thing he loved most to practice it. People who described him later, once he was already known across Europe, kept returning to the same details. Tall, fair skin, reddish hair, a face that looked serious even at rest, hands that moved constantly when he prayed, as if his body couldn't stay still even when his mind was fixed on one thing. A voice strong enough to carry across a crowded square without strain. None of that alone would have made him a saint. What people actually remembered was smaller than that. He rarely spoke about anything except God or the people he was trying to help. Even his silence had a kind of intensity to it. You could be in a room with him and feel like nothing else in the room mattered as much as whatever he was thinking about. After his studies, Domingo was ordained and joined the canons regular attached to the Cathedral of Osma, living a disciplined, semi-monastic life under a bishop named Diego de Acevedo. Diego recognized something in him early, a stillness combined with an intensity, and pulled him close as a companion and advisor. Within Osma's small community, Domingo had already gained a reputation, at just under 30 years old, as sub-prior, someone the older canons trusted to keep the discipline of the house, even though he was younger than most of them. In 1203, King Alfonso VIII of Castile sent Bishop Diego on a diplomatic mission to negotiate a royal marriage in the north. Diego brought Domingo with him. Their route took them through the south of France, through a region called Languedoc. What they rode into was a region losing its faith in plain sight, town after town. Languedoc was thick with a heresy known as Catharism, sometimes called the Albigensian heresy, after the town of Albi. The Cathars thought that the physical world itself was evil, made by a lesser or even demonic power, and that only the spirit mattered. Marriage, the body, even the eating of meat, all of it was suspect to them. The leaders, called the perfecti, lived in visible austerity, wearing simple black robes, eating almost nothing, fasting constantly. And that was the problem for the Catholic clergy trying to win people back. Local priests showed up in fine robes, riding good horses, living comfortably off church revenues, while the Cathar perfecti starved themselves in public as a form of preaching. People believed the ones who looked like they meant it. Diego and Domingo saw this immediately. In Toulouse, according to one early account, they spent a whole night in the same room as an innkeeper who held Cathar beliefs, arguing and praying with him until dawn, and didn't leave until he was persuaded back. It's remembered as Domingo's first conversion. It set the pattern for everything that came after. Stay in the room. Don't leave until it's finished. That pattern, night after night, house after house, was not gentle conversation. The public debates between Catholic preachers and Cathar perfecti in this period followed a real, structured format, sometimes lasting for days, with judges appointed by local nobles to decide who had argued more convincingly according to scripture. Domingo took part in several of these formal disputations, in towns like Montreal and Pamiers, standing for hours in front of crowds that had already made up their minds long before he opened his mouth. He kept showing up to the same towns more than once. That detail matters. Most traveling preachers passed through once and moved on. Domingo returned and returned again to villages that had already rejected him the first time, because he seemed to believe that persistence itself was a form of argument the Cathars couldn't easily counter. Diego went back to Rome and told the Pope something uncomfortable. If the church wanted to win back Languedoc, its own preachers would have to give up their comfort first. You cannot out-argue a starving man's credibility by riding in on a better horse than his. Diego received permission to try it. He sent most of his own retinue home, kept a small band of preachers, and set out on foot, dressed as simply as the Cathars themselves, to debate them publicly, town by town, on their own terms. Domingo stayed. Diego eventually returned to Spain and died there in 1207. Domingo remained in Languedoc, now essentially alone, continuing the work with barely any resources and almost no support. For nearly a decade, that is exactly what he did. He walked from town to town on foot. He debated Cathar theologians in public squares. He fasted, he slept on the ground or not at all. He begged for food instead of accepting hospitality that felt too comfortable. He wept, according to those who knew him, actual tears for the souls he believed were being lost, and it barely worked. A handful of converts here and there, yes, but the heresy held. The perfecti still had more credibility on the ground than most of the clergy sent to fight them. Domingo kept working anyway because he didn't know what else faithfulness looked like. In 1206, in the middle of this long, grinding effort, he founded a small monastery at Prouille, meant as a refuge for women who had been raised in Cathar households, some of them daughters of the perfecti themselves, girls with nowhere else to go once they left that world. Think about who these women actually were. Raised inside a system that taught them the physical world was corrupt, that their own bodies were a kind of trap. Some of them had already been living under the extreme fasting and isolation the perfecti demanded of their most devoted followers. Leaving that behind didn't mean they had somewhere safe to go. Their own families were often still Cathar. The surrounding towns didn't trust them either way. Prouille gave them a place to live, be fed properly, and be educated without demanding they immediately profess a faith they hadn't fully worked through yet. It became Domingo's base of operations. It also became, according to tradition, the site of the most important night of his life, 10 years of walking, 10 years of arguing, 10 years of watching people nod politely and go home unchanged. If you've ever prayed for something for a decade and watched nothing move, this is where Domingo was. That is where he knelt, sometime around 1208, alone in the chapel at Prouille, at the end of a day that looked exactly like every other day that hadn't worked. According to the story that has been handed down through Dominican tradition for 8 centuries, the Virgin Mary appeared to him there, in that empty room, in the middle of 10 years of failure. And she didn't come with a new argument against the Cathars. She came with a string of beads and put it in his hands. This was the weapon he had been missing, she told him. Not arguing harder, not fasting longer. Just a prayer repeated, said with the fingers moving bead by bead, walking through the life of her son from his conception to his death and back to life again. The same words returning like water wearing down stone. According to one much later account, written by Saint Louise de Montfort, she told him plainly that his preaching had failed, not for lack of effort, but because the ground itself had not been prepared. Before God renewed the world, she said, He sent the rain of the angelic greeting first. Preach the Rosary, she told him, and you will see fruit where you have seen none. Historians place this moment differently. Some say 1208, some 1214. Some believe the Rosary grew slowly out of older prayer practices, with Domingo as its great early apostle rather than the one man who received the whole thing in a single night. What no historian disputes is what he did next. Domingo began preaching the Rosary itself now. This repeated, almost hypnotic prayer, walking through the mysteries of Christ's life bead by bead, instead of leading with theology or fasting alone. Something shifted, slowly and only in part. People who had been unmoved by years of arguments started coming back. In 1208, the tension in Languedoc broke into open war. A papal legate named Pierre de Castelnau was murdered, and Pope Innocent III called for what became known as the Albigensian Crusade. Domingo, who had spent years trying to win Languedoc back through preaching and poverty, now watched it become a battlefield. He stayed close to the fighting, not as a combatant, but as a spiritual presence among the troops led by Simon de Montfort, a nobleman who had also become Domingo's personal friend. Before Montfort's most important engagement, the Battle of Muret in 1213, Domingo is said to have taught the soldiers to pray the Rosary before they marched. Montfort's forces were badly outnumbered by most accounts several times over, facing an army led by Peter II, the King of Aragon, who had ridden north specifically to break the crusade. By the standard math of medieval warfare, Montfort's side should not have won that day, and they won decisively in a battle that historians still describe as a stunning reversal, one that effectively ended the military phase of the war in the Crusaders' favor. Montfort himself believed it was no accident. He credited the victory to the Rosary and to the prayers said before it, and he wasn't alone in that belief. Word of what had happened at Muret spread through Languedoc faster than any sermon Domingo had preached in the previous 10 years. Not as a private devotion for quiet moments only, but as something people now turn to in the worst circumstances they could imagine. And that brings us back to where we started. The exorcism I opened this video with comes from a text written generations after Domingo's death by Saint Louis-Marie Grignon de Montfort called The Secret of the Rosary. In it, he tells the story of a possessed man brought before Domingo while he was preaching. Domingo questioned the demons directly. Under that questioning, unable to lie, they admitted there were 15,000 of them inside that one body because the man had spent his life fighting against the 15 mysteries of the Rosary. That number doesn't come from a court record. It comes from a spiritual writer telling a story he didn't witness himself, about a man he never met. Take it as arithmetic if you want. I take it as something else, a way of saying how much resistance one small prayer, repeated with real attention, was believed strong enough to break. By the time Domingo reached his late 30s, he had a small but growing group of men who wanted to live and preach the way he did. In 1215, he formally proposed founding a new religious order built specifically around study and preaching, something the church didn't yet have in quite this form. Existing orders were built around either enclosed contemplative life or basic pastoral care. Domingo wanted something different. Men trained deeply in theology, living in voluntary poverty like the perfecti they had spent years arguing against, but sent out constantly to preach, not to stay behind monastery walls. Pope Honorius III approved the order in December of 1216. It became known as the Order of Preachers, and its members came to be called Dominicans after him. Their motto, still used today, was simple: to praise, to bless, to preach. The order grew fast, faster than almost anyone expected. Domingo sent his earliest followers out in small groups almost immediately, to Paris, to Bologna, to Spain, deliberately scattering them into major university cities instead of keeping them close to him. He wanted the order to plant itself where serious thinking was already happening, not to build a private circle around himself. Some of his own brothers questioned that decision at the time. They had barely 16 men total when he started dividing them into groups of 6 or 7 and scattering them across an entire continent. It looked to some of them like abandoning a fragile project before it had roots. Domingo's answer was that grain doesn't multiply by staying in the barn. Within a decade, houses of the order existed in France, Italy, Spain, England, and the German lands, run largely by men who had joined within the last few years and had almost no formal training in leadership beyond what they had absorbed by watching him. He was demanding about study. Unlike some religious orders of the time that treated learning with suspicion, Domingo insisted his preachers actually understand the theology they were defending, not simply memorize the responses. Priories were built near universities specifically so friars could study alongside the best minds available, a decision that would later produce, within a single generation, one of the greatest theologians in the Church's history, a young Dominican named Thomas Aquinas. People who knew him personally described a man who barely slept, who spent long stretches of the night in prayer or in tears for people he had never met, who traveled almost entirely on foot even as an older man, who owned close to nothing, and also, according to those same accounts, a man who was warm, who could laugh, who was easy to be around despite the severity of his own private discipline. He didn't demand from others what he demanded from himself. He simply lived it and let people decide for themselves whether they wanted to follow. By 1220, the order held its first general chapters, formal meetings to organize how it would govern itself going forward, and Domingo insisted on structures that limited even his own authority as founder. He didn't want the order to depend on any one man, including himself, to survive. He didn't have long left to test that instinct. In the summer of 1221, exhausted after years of travel that would have broken a much younger body, Domingo fell seriously ill in Bologna. He was moved to the priory there, among his own brothers, the men he had personally sent out across an entire continent, now gathered close around the bed of the one man who had sent them. Some of them had walked for days to reach him in time. Others didn't make it before the end. He asked them not to mourn extravagantly. He told them, according to Dominican tradition, that he would be more useful to them after death than he had been in life, that he would keep helping them from heaven. The way he had once believed a small string of beads could help a whole region that theology alone couldn't reach. He gave them a few final instructions instead of a long farewell speech. Live in charity. Keep humility. Hold on to voluntary poverty, the same poverty he had chosen as a young man selling his own books during a famine, the same poverty he had worn like armor through a decade of debates in Languedoc. He died on August 6, 1221, in that priory in Bologna, surrounded by the men he had scattered across Europe and who had come home one last time to be with him. He was 50 years old, 2 days short of his 51st birthday. Less than 13 years later, in 1234, Pope Gregory IX, who had known Domingo personally, canonized him a saint. The order he founded on foot with almost nothing, funded by nothing but the credibility of men willing to live as poor as the people they preached to, would go on to shape Catholic theology for the next 8 centuries, producing thinkers like Thomas Aquinas within a single generation of Domingo's own death. Strip away the theology and the history, and here's what's left. A man who tried everything he knew how to do for 10 straight years, and mostly failed, who kept showing up anyway, who was finally handed, according to the faith that has carried his story this far, something so small it could disappear inside a closed fist, and told that this was the thing that would work. Before the prayer, I want to tell you something. He's not alone in heaven interceding for us. There are other intercessors listening too. Saint Benedict, who protects against evil. Padre Pio, who carried the wounds of Christ in his own body. Saint Joseph, patron of the family. Saint Rita, the saint of impossible causes. Saint Michael the Archangel, God's own warrior. And Saint Monica, who wept for 30 years for her son's conversion and was heard. I gathered their stories, their prayers, and what they taught about faith into one devotional guide, something you can use to pray for your home, your children, and your own life of faith. It's called 7 Powerful Intercessors to Protect Your Faith and Your Family. You'll find it in the first pinned comment under this video. Look for it once the prayer is finished. Let's close this time together with a prayer. If you're carrying someone in your heart right now, someone who is suffering, someone far from God, someone sick, someone in danger, brings them with you into this prayer. He hears you. Saint Dominic, you spent 10 years preaching to people who would not listen, and you did not stop. If someone reading this feels like their prayers have accomplished nothing, like they've done everything right and still see no fruit, stand with them the way you once stood in that empty chapel before the answer came. Intercede. Saint Dominic, you sold your own books to feed the hungry while you were still a student with nothing to spare. If someone here is afraid there isn't enough, not enough money, not enough time, not enough of themselves left to give, show them what it looks like to give from an empty hand anyway. Intercede. Saint Dominic, you faced a possession so severe it took 15,000 voices to answer your questions, and you did not back away. If someone watching this feels attacked in ways they can't fully explain, oppressed, exhausted, spiritually worn down by something they can't name, stand between them and it. Intercede. Saint Dominic, you were given something small, a string of beads, and told it would do what 10 years of your own strength could not. If someone here has stopped believing that small, ordinary prayer still matters, put it back in their hands. Intercede. Saint Dominic, intercede for us. Amen. If you cried at any point during this video, it wasn't by accident. God doesn't waste tears. Every one of them is a prayer he collects. Write in the comments, Saint Dominic, intercede for me. And if there's someone you want to ask his intercession for, write their name too. Just that, he knows the rest. If this video touched you, share it with someone who needs it today. With that person who is struggling and doesn't know there's an intercessor in heaven waiting for someone to tell them. You can be that someone. Give this channel a like so it can keep bringing these stories to more families. And subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Right now on your screen, the story of another intercessor God also prepared for you is appearing. Click it, we'll meet you there.